Hi, I'm Veronica Tash. I want to remind you once again, think critically. Today we're going to go over video by Metatron. It has about 948,000 views, 48,000 likes. I've seen it praised over places. Um, it drove me nuts when I first saw it, as well as his follow up one. But I've seen him recently uh, talking about how good it was again, and it set me off. I need to go actually address this because it is a very, very bad video. And I'm not going to say that Metatron does bad videos generally. In fact, I started watching him a few years ago, became a subscriber of his for a while, um, until he started doing daily videos. Daily videos really changed things. Before he focused on things that he or his team of experts. And let's just go over briefly what those experts are.
And then I have a bunch of researchers, professionals behind me, PhD, postdoctoral, anthropologist, classicist, Egyptologist, linguist, and they help me carry the load of.
Now, his experts are specialized in linguistics like him or in history. Um, he does videos on that stuff. It's generally a very good video. You want to see his video on whether Cleopatra is black, I'll give my full endorsement to that. But he started going into things that he really shouldn't have, where neither he nor his um, team of experts had any expertise in. And this is one of those issues, because he's not just covering Nazism historically, he is trying to address the question of whether they're right wing or left wing. And he fails miserably because he lacks any expertise at this and is trying to make a point. He's putting his politics into the video, and he does have a problem with that. Everybody has some sort of politics that they're carrying with them. There's a bias of some sort. You can try to get rid of it, but he seems to only see the politics when it is very, very, very far on the right. Straight up white supremacy video type thing, or if it's something that's at all on the left. And he will read that into experts who have some basic sociological understanding of issues that he seems to have zero understanding of and zero intellectual interest in trying to understand the arguments they're making. He just dismisses it as they're pushing politics. Um, which it's not that they're not pushing politics at all, but it's not more than any average person would. Um, any average professional would. Uh, you're talking about very straightforward things such as there being biases in society and whatnot. Not every criticism he's made about that is incorrect, but by and large, he ends up making um, pretty bad criticisms when it comes to that. And so, like I said, Metatron's not a bad creator overall. He's just trying to get stuff to fill in, posting every single day because he figures that's going to get him more money, and it's really negatively impacting the quality of his work. So let us. I wouldn't click so I could see it, not so that you could see it. Let's share the screen. Oh, not the right screen share. Okay. So here's our video, and I went through and I made some notes on this. And I'm going to be stopping quite frequently, pointing out where there's issues, and a couple places where he does make a good point. Let's get started here.
Was Nazism left-wing or right-wing? Well, believe it or not, this question gets asked around a lot, and there are several creators that provided answers. Well, the thing is that today's answer will be grounded on history and political science. But before we do that, let's talk about the question proper. This question is a form of ahistorical syllogism. You'll see several people giving you answers today in the comments down below. The same people will not watch this video and they will type either obviously was right-wing or of course it was left-wing. In my opinion, there are two major problems here. One, they use the American left-right dichotomy or...
Now here I want to point out it's not an American left-right dichotomy. The left-right dichotomy is universal. It applies worldwide and theoretically would apply to worlds beyond ours. Now, obviously, there is, intelligent alien life out there somewhere. The question is whether they could ever reach us. But, vast majority of scientists in the field say, obviously, they're out there. It's just a matter of numbers. It's so incredibly unlikely that we'd be the only ones. It should apply to them as well. It's the same kind of dynamics. This is not something that you would expect to be specific even to humanity. Our actual, calling it left-right, I mean, other worlds may not call it left-right, but it comes from the French legislature after the French Revolution. The people who were considered left wing here, set on the literal left wing of the legislature. People who were considered right wing, as we described it, set on the right wing of the legislature. At this time, you're looking at on the left, and this might be mirrored. I'm not sure, but for me, this is my left. On the left-hand side, you have the people who were, you have very radical liberals at the very far left end of this. They're looking to change everything, get rid of the monarchy, get rid of the aristocracy. And when you're talking about this era, this is not just your average people, but your bourgeoisie, where you could have radical liberals amongst them. On the other end, you have your conservatives, people who did not want to see a whole lot of change, who wanted to just see some slight reforms or whatnot. They were on the right side. And so this is where we start with our dichotomy. It's gotten bigger over time, and it's grown to the left. So these radical liberals that would be considered very far left wing back in those days would not be considered very far left wing these days, but that's because we've uncovered a greater extent of how far politics can go. I don't think you're going to find something further right than absolute monarchy, which is where it starts from. Now, you also have the issue, the American Overton window is put very far to the right. Overton window is the window of views that are considered acceptable within society. You have, one point on the right, one point on the left, and it grows or moves post-move. And people who are inside that window are considered valid. People who are outside are basically ignored for the most part. And it's gone far, far to the right lately. But even when I was a teenager, you're looking at 1990s, we were far right wing compared to the rest of the world. The Democrats in those days were to the right of the British Conservative Party. You really, it's not an ideal window to look at. And what's ironic is it's not that other people are using this window, it's that he will be using that window. Let's move on.
Political spectrum, and they forcefully apply it to historical European political regimes and ideologies. Hence, the first problem with the Western proper is geographic or spatial in nature. Two,
And no, that is absolutely incorrect. There is no geographic relativism here. That's not how political science works in any way, shape, or form. The closest that you'll find is comparative politics that looks at individual cases in different countries. But even then, they're trying to look at creating a universal understanding of a phenomenon by removing those contexts from those different places. So, for example, I took a class in comparative politics on civil society. And so we looked at a whole bunch of different places, specifically on trying to form a working civil society in these areas. So we looked at America, we looked at Mexico, we looked at Brazil, we looked at Russia, we looked at China. And we're looking at these specific case studies. And from that, you try to create a general picture of what allows civil society to grow and what doesn't, what constitutes civil society and what does not, and so on. But that is as close as political science goes, and is not at all the sort of geographic relativism that Metatron puts forward. Okay, and basically, it's about superseding the context. We want to have that universal idea. So once again, left and right is a universal thing. It's not, this is left wing in America and right wing elsewhere. It's that, it's universal that it's left wing or right wing everywhere. We look at the whole, not just on very specific areas to try to analyze things.
Use 21st century political spectra and juxtapose them over 20th century politics. Thus, the second problem is temporal.
Now, once again, no, that's not at all how it works. This is the exact same problem. We wouldn't bother studying political science at all if it were that temporally bound. There are periods where certain features of political systems may be more powerful locally. You see the committee systems in the United States, Congress become very powerful in the 1940s for the 1970s. You see median voter theory seeming to work in around that same period of time. And then it starts falling apart outside of there. But that's because those weren't universal enough. You take that and you try to find something more universal. Ultimately, you're looking at how people govern one another, how they govern themselves, or how they are governed, because not every political system is democracy. There is no temporal bound, as Metatron says. That's a very historical analysis concept. It is not at all a political science concept.
Congruence between modern and 20th century political definitions within the right-left dichotomy is a complex phenomenon rooted in evolving socioeconomic shifting of global dynamics. Thus, this discrepancy necessitates of a nuanced analysis of the factors that contribute to this divergence.
No, that was a bunch of nonsense. It's basically a call to not see the forest for the trees. Look at very specific things and ignore what the big picture is. Which is not at all what you want to be doing. And that's not really nuanced. That's just cherry picking. And yeah, he will be cherry picking a bit throughout this.
In these dynamics, the correct and coherent answer is going to be fractal, as there is no clean definition overlap. History is a multidimensional phenomenon.
Okay, history is a multidimensional phenomenon, great. But this is not at all a historical question. We are talking about a political science question. Is this ideology left wing or right wing? That is a political science question, not a history question. Historical facts help illuminate the answer, but it's not a historical question at all. History asks what they did, it doesn't really analyze it. Though there is an exception, I did find something on universal history that is a field that tries to get these overarching ideas, but that changes history, and that's not where he's going. It doesn't match what he's talking about. Political science everywhere, we're looking for that universal idea. Even when you're looking at only a specific country, you're still pulling from these wider ideas. And if somebody specializes just in American politics, they're not thinking that this is exclusive to America. It's just that's the type of politics that they're focused on in their studies.
Expecting, therefore, 21st century American political ideas to overlap neatly and perfectly with 20th century European political factions in order to come out with an answer is a flawed analytical method. So,
no one expects it to align perfectly. There's you look for broad strokes that are ideological in nature. You don't look for everything to match exactly. You don't say, oh, it's not Nazism unless they unless they gain power burning down the legislature. That's like very, very specific, and it's not going to be very helpful in trying to define what is Nazism, because that's not something that was in any way inevitable. That doesn't come from it's not something that necessarily comes from the ideology. That is something that just happened to happen. So no, not everything's going to line up perfectly. No one is expecting that this is a red herring.
So, the people who are categorically stating it was left-wing, it was right-wing, are not answering to present a comprehensive analysis of policies, ideologies, historical actions, military interventions, economic, religious, and social positions pushed by said regimes. They are just insulting the other side.
As someone who is an expert broadly in this area, it was categorically right-wing. Because A is of the set B does not mean all B is A. So it is not insulting the right to note the objective fact that Nazism was on the right wing. Just because we say Nazism on the right wing doesn't mean that everyone who's on the right wing are Nazis. That's not how that works. It's something that he just been called a Nazi a lot, so he decides, oh, this is a horrible thing to ever call anybody, so let's ignore the actual thing things that are warning signs, because you don't want to call these Nazis because somebody else might be called a Nazi. That's not how any of this works.
You're free to do it, of course, but just so we're clear about what those answers are. Make no mistake, Nazi is a slur, and so people want to use it to identify and describe their political opponents.
No, Nazi is not a slur. It can be used as a slur, but that is not all its primary function. It describes an ideology, something that is an actual entity that you want to be very aware of. Because if you're not, it's going to come and bite you in the ass. Look at America. It bit us in the ass.
That is why, I would argue, it works as a conduit to the detriment of your political opposition when it comes to mass and public opinion. In this framework, fascism and Hitler currently have negative valence, they are derogatory, and with that established, the following coarsely represents the train of thought leading to this usage. Nazi bad. We all agree with that? Okay, you Nazi, you bad. It's a simple process, really. Clearly,
That's an argument to the consequences, possibly proving too much or affirming the consequent. Because it can be misapplied doesn't mean it can only be misapplied. It can be applied very appropriately, potentially, and has been several times. Was Himmler a Nazi? Yeah, Himmler was a Nazi. It's not simply a slur. You could also say that what he's doing is an appeal to civility. It's not nice, so don't claim it, which that's not helpful at all when we're trying to discuss serious issues. This fake civility is detrimental to political discourse.
Doesn't require any deep empirical analysis grounded on historical political science.
What is historical political science? Outdated explanations which have been replaced? I mean, I really don't know what he's trying to get at. It seems to be something that he just made up out of nowhere.
One of the reasons why the media uses the word constantly. Yeah, who would have thought the media's full of shit? You see, once you take that leap, your historical vision will be irreversibly tainted. The question is flawed to begin with because its basis, namely the expectations and the prism of evaluation, are not in alignment. And on top of that, this has rendered the traditional unidimensional political spectrum increasingly inadequate for capturing the complexity of 20th century political parties. And all of this reflects the ongoing evolution of political taxonomy. So, what do we do now? Well, to answer this correctly, first, we need to ensure objectivity to our analysis. Focus on attitudes towards private property, individual freedom, and wealth redistribution patterns. If needed, even implementing a mathematical apparatus. Also, we should explore and take into consideration the political allegiances that occurred historically and the sort of opposition to the regime in question, the Nazis. So let's do that. Welcome to our comprehensive qualitative analysis. Some people will use nomenclature as a gotcha moment to place the Nazis within the political spectrum. In other words, Nazism stands for National Socialism, so they were socialists, hence left-wing. Now, nomenclature alone cannot be used as the basis for classification. It's too shallow and unscientific as a parameter. This is regardless of whether you think they were left-wing or right-wing. Let me prove it to you. If the name of any given party is the basis of the argument of where they stand within the left-right dichotomy, then is the Communist Party in China Republican in the American sense? I mean, it's the People's Republic of China. Similarly, is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, aka North Korea, really democratic? Yeah, I didn't think so. And if you really...
Okay, here he actually makes a good point. I've used the DPRK example many times, trying to explain how just because they use the term doesn't mean that they are. Now, we should note that Mein Kampf gives some insight into this stuff as well. Hitler explains that they chose the color red to troll socialists. He didn't use the term troll, said just because it filled them with anger, but I mean, he's describing trolling. He was owning the Reds there. And he describes Marxism as the final stage of Judaism. And if my recollection strikes me right, Adolf Hitler was no fan of Jewish people, so that doesn't speak to him being very much a fan of the left wing. And just throughout, I mean, generally very, very anti-socialist. You could pull out quotes that are gold for proving no, Nazis were not left wing right out of Mein Kampf. Now, scholars claim either the term was so popular at the time that it was necessary for any new party to use the word socialist somewhere in there. That's one claim that scholars give. They'll also say that by socialists they meant nationalists. So they're the nationalists. Which probably meets, I mean, it makes sense. I'm not sure that's what actually happened, but they definitely don't have any actual socialism in there. I can point out that used to be at least that neo-Nazis would argue online, that socialism is any ideology that sees man as a social animal. So basically, if you're not an anarchist, and a very specific kind of anarchist, you're a socialist, and that's just a ridiculous claim outright. But yeah, there's absolutely no reason to believe that the term socialist there describes them being actual socialists. They were trolls.
I want to break your brain. I made a video not too long ago talking about ancient democracies, such as, for example, Greek democracy, which was a form of pure democracy, and then I compared it to modern democracies and to see what they differed and what areas they had in common. Well, in the comment section of that video, as it happened, my American viewers began a flame war whereby you had people saying, no, America is a democracy, and other people saying, no, America is a constitutional republic. Right. Well, do you know what Italy is? Well, after the referendum of the 2nd of June 1946, Italy abolished monarchy and became officially, wait for it, una repubblica democratica.
Democracy involves the rule of the people, rule of the many, and republic has to do with working towards a common good. It's James Madison in Federalist 10 did just make up a new definition out of nowhere that people still use this day. Sadly, some people in political science still use Madison's definition of republic, which is representative democracy. But no, republics have nothing to do with that at all historically. You look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau writing beforehand, talking about the republic, and he's arguing that you could have a republic with a monarch. He thought it was much less likely because a monarch is much more likely to use their private will rather than the general will, but it's technically possible. Oligarchy, more possible, but still unlikely. He preferred democracy because democracy was most likely to produce that expression of the general will. But you could theoretically have a republic with a monarchy is the important part. So it has nothing to do with what Madison was talking about. Oh, I thought you'd play.
Translates as a democratic republic. Yeah, welcome to Europe. You think that's confusing? Well, in the United States, simple liberalism often means social liberalism, and a liberal is a left-winger. But in Europe, simple liberalism often means classical liberalism, which can be a center-right position, particularly for those right-wing populist movements that embrace economic policies which in America will be associated with the left.
Now, what liberalism is, it's it's widely diverse in whether some may consider it on the left or the right based on which expression of liberalism we're talking about, and the Overton window there. However, liberalism is never more left than the median line in reality, where social democracy begins. So you have the most left-wing forms of liberalism on the right side of that line, that center line. And then you have the most right-wing forms of social democracy on the other side. Social democracy and welfare liberalism basically do the same things, but they have different intentions. Welfare liberals try to tame capitalism, but they want to maintain capitalism, whereas social democrats have an eventual goal that they want to create socialism piecemeal through evolution rather than revolution. And they tend to do the same things. You're talking about having these, big welfare programs and things like that take care of the average person, make sure that they can enjoy freedom as well. And they're doing the same thing for different results in the end, but they tend to be people to get along. They don't necessarily even see themselves as all that different. You can look at someone like Alexia Ocasio-Cortez. And she is a welfare liberal, but she will call herself a democratic socialist because Bernie Sanders messed up the use of that term and really misconstrued it. And I think I'm going to cover that elsewhere. But, she doesn't really know where she actually is on that line, but she would be a welfare liberal there because she does believe, she has said she believes in capitalism. Uh, Somehow thinks she could be a democratic socialist and a capitalist. So she is, on the very left end of the right wing, but she's still technically a right winger. You could call her, centrist because, you have those welfare liberals, social democrats. There we have our political center. But um, and of course, liberalism is always to the total left of monarchism, oligarchy, or fascism. Yeah, and I got a little bit more before I have to say more.
While at the same time promoting cultural and social conservatism. And on that note, since we're talking about what a party named itself, do you want to know what Hitler said when it comes to left or right? Well, Hitler denied that Nazism was either left-wing or right-wing. Instead, he officially portrayed Nazism as a, open quotes, syncretic movement. Yeah, let's ditch the whole name argument, shall we?
Now, neither left nor right is a marketing scheme appealing to a false populism designed to reinstate absolute monarchism under a different name. That's what fascism is. It distinctly is an anti Enlightenment or counter Enlightenment movement, opposing liberalism's inroads on all fronts. That is democracy, liberty, equality, and rationalism. Elon Musk also claimed to be neither left wing nor right wing, probably knowing where that came from. And how did I miss a big section on liberalism? Okay. Yeah, here's where I miss. I need to go more into liberalism. Liberalism is an ideology which seeks to maximize the liberty of the individual. It formally arose in the age of absolutism and stood for the Enlightenment ideas of democracy, liberty, equality, and rationalism. I just said that fascism is opposed to. It is always capitalist. That's something that you need to remember. Don't call liberals socialists. They're not. They're not liberals if they're socialists. Um, Socialism actually was the Marxist form of socialism that we're used to talking about. Not the ancient. I mean, you go back to the Middle Ages, you have communal socialists like Thomas More, but the socialists that we're used to talking about, it began as a critique of liberalism that it failed to meet the Enlightenment goals that it set for itself. It's not living up to the Enlightenment. So socialism seeks to go further to be pro-Enlightenment. That doesn't mean everyone who calls themselves socialist is pro-Enlightenment. There's generally anyone who calls themselves a Marxist-Leninist, which includes Stalinists, will attack the idea of the Enlightenment as some bourgeois blah blah blah. But actual Marxist socialists, very very pro-Enlightenment. But it fragmented as over the years as contradictions became clear. So you have your classic liberals who support unbridled individual liberty and laissez-faire, though laissez-faire originally was let's not work in favor of companies, let them fend for themselves as opposed to let's not regulate them. But we changed the meaning of laissez-faire over the years. You have welfare liberals who say you cannot have freedom, you cannot use. So they make sure that people have education, that they have good health, that they have the ability to actually move from job to job if they wish. You have neoliberalism with its austerity, unbridled capitalism. Then you have your anarcho-capitalism, which believes that there should be no government but corporate government. And actually, I haven't read it myself, but Novick, one of their primary authors, I remember learning about it, and he really he's a very big anarcho-capitalist and traced his ultimate end. And what he comes up with is basically you have one corporation that ends up taking over everything, then forces people who are not buying its services to buy those services, and basically becomes an authoritarian government. There's your anarcho-capitalist vision for the future. I think it probably is interesting where he goes, but trying to figure out exactly where he went into that, I'm not 100% sure myself. But these are developing ideologies. They're not historically specific ideologies. There's still monarchists out there today. You look at the classic liberals, are basically, we're not changing at all from where liberalism started. These are not temporally bound ideologies. They may be bigger in some eras than others, but they're not temporarily bound.
So, what do I propose as an alternative? Well, personally, I think that the best way to define Nazism is a totalitarian dictatorship. That's going to be our basic core.
Totalitarian dictatorship covers much more than Nazism. Nazism is a subset of fascism, a racist subset in particular. All fascism is totalitarian. Stalinism too is totalitarian, but not quite fascist, and questionable if it's on the left or not. This is like defining Nazism as government. It's too broad of a definition. And I think this is where I'm supposed to go here. We get a little bit of idea about totalitarianism. We get the book Totalitarianism by Michael Curtis. If politics is organized dispute about the power involving choice among competing values and persons, then totalitarianism is a negation of politics in its lack of freedom of choice. It's in its claim to create definitive social conditions, and in its demand to control both social life and individual conscience in order to create a new type of man. The distinctiveness of totalitarianism arises, as Orwell argued, and Orwell did actually coin the term democratic socialism, meaning something completely different than Bernie Sanders does, in the effort to control thoughts and emotions as well as actions. So this is where we really get to what totalitarianism actually is. It's looking to control you on every level, to actually affect the way that you think, not just the way that you act. And I think that is something key that we tend to lose here.
Or definition to identify what we are talking about, instead of using the American left-right spectrum. Then, after having established firmly what Nazism is, we can then look at the policies one by one and decide from an American contemporary perspective which of these lean right and which lean left, based on their salience. Alright, that sounds good on paper, but let's try if it works. What defines totalitarianism? Centralized authority, strength in the military, militarism with resources directed to domestic population, authoritarianism and dictatorial rule, repression of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, systematic elimination of political opposition by violence, expansionistic foreign policies.
Okay, we have this list, and it's not really a good list of totalitarianism. It has some good things in there that are definitely part of totalitarianism. You have your centralized authority, your authoritarianism and dictatorial rule, repression of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Yes, those are good. They belong there. They're not really definitive, I don't think, of totalitarianism, because there's deeper concepts that this has to do with, which is one person controlling everything about everyone. But conquest isn't necessary at all for totalitarianism. So it's something that they do often, but it's not something that's absolutely required. There's nothing totalitarian about conquest. A bunch of other people do conquest other than totalitarians, and it doesn't speak to the point of totalitarianism to do conquest. Authoritarians of all sorts tend to be militaristic. That's there. You use the military against domestic population. If you use the police force instead of the military, it'd still be totalitarianism. So that's not really a good thing to throw in there. Where was I? Totalitarian is about controlling the totality of life. Thoughts, not just actions. The military is a likely vector for control, but is not a necessary one. I believe it always has been used, but it doesn't have to be used.
And conquest through military might. Already note that all three historical totalitarian regimes of the 20th century fit very neatly within this box: German Nazism, Italian fascism, and Soviet communism. In other words, when we examine the practical manifestations of these 20th century regimes, striking similarities emerge. For instance, the lack of individualism and individual freedom. Benito Mussolini himself publicly stated that fascism is anti-individualistic and accepts the individual only in as far as the interests coincide with those of the state. Well, yeah, but then again, communism, fascism, and Nazism might be considered quite different when it comes to their core ideology. So, Metatron, are you really sure that they would fit each and every single one of these? Okay, let me prove it to you. Number one, centralized authority. Absolutely, all three. Strength in the military. Do I even need to comment that? Militarism with resources directed to domestic population. Well, in the case of the Nazi, of course, that meant the Jews, and it meant gypsies, and every single person that opposed the Nazi regime. But when it comes to Stalin, well, he murdered more of his own people than he did of his foreign enemies. Just putting it out there. Authoritarianism and dictatorial rule, repression of freedom of speech. But what about the freedom of speech part? And are we sure? Well, let me prove it to you. Let's do a little thought exercise. You are in 1940s Germany. You disagree with Adolf Hitler's opinions, so you go to Berlin, and in front of the whatever government building that they have there, you say, Hitler was an idiot. Yeah. Do you think you're going to survive that? And into the concentration camps you go. But what about Italian fascism? Well, you go to Rome and you state right in the main plaza, Benito Mussolini was an absolute moron. And there you go, dead in the prison. Well, you probably...
Now, here I just want to jump in to say he should be saying is, not was. Hitler is an idiot, not Hitler was an idiot. Because Hitler was still alive when it was illegal for you to say that. You can go to Berlin right now, you can yell Adolf Hitler was a piece of shit. No one's going to have a problem with that. And if they do have a problem with that, they're going to keep it to themselves. Because a lot, I'm not 100% sure if that's illegal, but there's a lot involving, you can't do the Nazi salute there. You will be arrested. When Elon Musk did his Roman salute, they blurted out in Germany because it very clearly was a Nazi salute. So they were still alive back then. You want to say that he is this, not that he was this.
You die before you even reach the prison, but if you do reach the prison, you'll die in there. And once again, let's teleport you to Soviet Russia. You are in front of the Kremlin and you say, Stalin, who is a monster. Gulag, immediate, no freedom of speech. In fact, freedom of speech is the first thing that goes when it comes to totalitarianism. I might make a dedicated video to that. If you appreciate my content so far and wish to help ensure my ability to continue to tell it how it is, regardless of any possible backlash, please support this channel on Patreon. Any support helps me and my team of academics keep the channel strong and gives us the means to fight back against the political rewriting of history. Stand with us, form the wall, defend the truth. So what this tells us is that these are not necessarily unique features of the right or the left, but they manifest as common ground on the extremes of said spectrum. It's the horseshoe effect.
It's never called the horseshoe effect, it's called the horseshoe theory. It's also nonsense that's peddled online by American centrists to denounce relatively centrist overall Berniecrats and Democratic Socialists, which are to their left as being far right. That's what this is. I mean, Dig doesn't get a whole lot of coverage in political science literature, but that which exists pretty thoroughly debunks the idea. I mean, it's very, very shallow thinking. And the first reference I've seen to it was practically somebody joking about the horseshoe theory. They weren't, even though they were purporting it, they weren't taking it seriously themselves. But to alter that, we have fishhook theory that goes this is how leftists responded to the centrists pulling it up. And it goes, boom, the far right's just like the centrists. That's, and there's some basis for saying that. Both of them are bullshit, though. This is basically just trolling the liberals who are throwing out horseshoe theory bullshit. Not really liberals, or conservatives that do that call themselves liberals.
Extremes touch, even if, ideologically, when compared with communism, fascism is indeed right-wing. You have authoritarian control. Both Hitler and Stalin established it. It was absolute, centralized power. Propaganda and information control. I mean, the Nazis were quite famous for burning books, and a lot of those books were in fact communist books and socialist books, by the way. Terror and repression. And yes, mass executions were common on all of these regimes. Now, in Europe, conventionally, Nazism is generally considered to be a far-right ideology, also due to their allegiances with the fascists in Italy and their countering of Stalin and communism, which is, of course, a left-wing extreme ideology. 22nd of June 1941 and the invasion of the Soviet Union should stand as a clear definition of that. Besides, under Hitler, the newspapers of the Social Democratic parties are banned, functionaries are arrested, and whatnot. But once you start to look at this from the American political perspective, then the situation becomes muddy, if you will, necessitating a more nuanced item-by-item approach.
Here is where Metatron goes way off the rails. There was no mud. He is muddying the waters right now. History looks at things like this generally, piecemeal like this generally. It sees the differences, specifics of what happened, other than, as we discussed earlier, universal history. Political science seeks connections to find universal truths about politics, how society is organized by humans. When asking a political science question such as, is Nazism left or right, this is just unacademic to do what Metatron is trying to do. This comes from a failing to understand these issues on a deep level and taking a superficial look at the policies. It's going to be very, very superficial look at these things, including one thing that's just not true.
You see, the Nazis, for example, had nationalized healthcare. Government was deeply involved in every aspect of industry, so we're talking about big government. The Nazis were not in favor of free market capitalists.
Okay, I skipped a couple spots, so we're going to cover it really fast. Nazi healthcare policies were eugenically based. That's essentially what you're looking at there. Here's from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum about Nazi health. Here's what stood out. It's all about how it was basically eugenics. We're going to take it away from anyone who's not Aryan. We're going to make sure Aryans have special programs that promotes healthy living and raising the birth rates and all that. That's what stood out. It's not national health care. In fact, when we look at national health care, it was already there before the Nazis got there. They just didn't get rid of it. And, it's not even a recent thing. It was after the First or Second Reich was united in 1871 that they created their national healthcare system. So this is around for 60 years before Hitler gets into power. You're going to say because they didn't dismantle something that the people relied on fast enough, that means that he's completely pro healthcare. That's just not really properly thinking about it. This is the lie here, because it's just that bad. Where the history is bad on Metatron's part. I don't expect that he's going to know a whole lot about political science. I'm trying to correct that, but here this is him getting the history wrong, which really surprises me. And now, when we talk about big government, that's also not a left-right issue at all. Do you know who had big government? Monarchies. The administration that's then serves the interests of the monarch. The king could demand his subjects be Catholic or Protestant or Muslim or Pastafarian. In the American context, big government has been a neoliberal catchword, describing social programs serving the interests of the populace. Completely different thing. Interests of one person at the very top versus the masses. This is your welfare, social security, agencies that act to tell employers they can't discriminate against you on the basis of religion. I mean, it's almost diametrically opposed. And you could argue pretty well that it is diametrically opposed. I'm not going to go that far here. There are completely different things that Metatron muddies together. And we're about a second away, aren't we? From where I'm supposed to stop next one.
And yet, yes, I'll defend this one in the next section. And
I will debunk it in the next section.
Of this sounds left of center to an American, so it is mixed. On the following section, I'm going to present the characteristics of the regime, and then you decide where it leans the most towards. This way, we can promote critical thinking. Now, Nazism was characterized by extreme nationalism, state-funded welfare programs.
Okay, now, nationalism is the belief that certain populations are naturally of the soil. Think of how the Nazis are marching, yelling blood and soil in Charlottesville, which is a reference to a slightly pre-Nazi era, very, very racist book. And have a natural national character. It calls for national purity by removing individuals who don't belong to that national group, lest they weaken that nation. It is largely tied to hierarchy, which is a right-wing concept. In fact, those shown to be genetically predispositioned to be on the right are more likely to support hierarchy as natural and beneficial. It is tied to the right-wing counter-enlightenment movement of elitism. Of course, it's also a counter-enlightenment movement itself, nationalism. Um, on social welfare, though there were some, it was racially restricted, and Nazism was still um, was still ideologically opposed to welfare. Let's jump ahead. National Socialist People's Welfare. You can read right on Wikipedia. I have no reason to believe that this is inaccurate right now. The Wikipedia is not the best source. I don't have a whole bunch of time to go get the best sources for this stuff. I wrote this all up last night and pulled up everything that we need. While the Nazi Party had existed since 1920, it did not initially set up its own welfare department, as several other German parties had done. Its Nazi ideology was, in principle, unfavorable to the idea of social welfare. Talk about Mein Kampf, about how Hitler was talking about how much he hated them, the degenerate and the feeble. And keep in mind, those were victims of the Holocaust. He killed the degenerate, the feeble. He killed, 6.5 million Jews. He killed a bunch of Roma. He killed a bunch of Slavs. He killed Jehovah's Witnesses, Freemasons, intellectia. He killed leftists of various sorts, socialists, communists, anarchists. No one from the right got lumped in there. These are people that he had targeted, and that's also a great sense. Who did he kill? Who were the political opponents of National Socialism that were sent to a concentration camp way before anyone else? It wasn't a death camp yet, still a concentration camp, but what was it called? I'm drawing a blank. Starts with a D. Dachau. He sent leftists of various sorts to Dachau as political enemies of the Reich. He did not do that to anybody that was right. He didn't do it to liberals. He didn't do it to the conservatives. He didn't do it to monarchists or anything. He did it just to the left. Where does Nazism stand? That's a pretty telling thing that, of course, Metatron doesn't bother bringing up. You can look through here if you want. You know exactly where to find it. But basically, it was a very basic thing. But Metatron makes it seem like it's some really big thing that was central to them, rather than saying that basically all governments did. There were poorhouses in Victorian England. Victorian England was obviously not a bastion of charity and looking out for the poor. People are the third the third level of things that you could get was sleeping in a freaking coffin. Over the penny hangover, and I forget what the other thing was. That was 2 cents. This is not something that defines Nazism in any way, shape, or form. It's something that basically all governments do. But because they do something that might be considered left wing, then it's not that simple. It's really just him manipulating things here. I don't think he knows he's doing it. I think it's completely unconscious on his part, but he is manipulating things, and we're going to discuss that later.
If there were any form of identity politics similar to contemporary political discourse, of course the Nazis would have been against it, but so would have been the communists. They had state control of industries.
Now, it's common for governments to control production in the middle of a war, and that's essentially where the Nazis were for the most of the period. Do you know who else told companies what to produce during World War II? The U.S. and Britain. Kings, communists, kings, the communists that they were, you know, they gave exclusive charters limiting others from certain production of trade. Now they're left wing communists. These kings going telling people what they can and can't do. You know, you can look at the Wealth of Nations to see a lot about that. And yeah, it's not really, like I say, he's not looking deep into it. He just sees that there's state control. Doesn't look at the nature of the state control or why it's happening, or at the fundamental relations there. He's just simply saying, oh, there's state control of the industries. We'll leave it at that. But on the relevant issues, Nazis did outlaw unions. And when Coca-Cola plants were repurposed to make Fanta, Hitler assured the profits were saved for Coca-Cola for after the war. He was against the idea of socialism there for sure. He was so concerned with property rights that even though Coca-Cola was over where they're at war with Coca-Cola's country, America, they were saving the profits because that belongs obviously to these people who own the factories. It doesn't belong to the people who are working them and actually making things, or the state that makes that possible. No, these guys save all those profits for Coca-Cola. Now, socialism calls for the collective ownership and control of the means of production. That's what left is. To liberate the worker, to put workplaces under democratic control and allow workers the full value of their labor, something Lenin had undid after the Russian Revolution, arguing they weren't ready for socialism. It had to use state capitalism until a revolution in the West. You can look at his work, The Tax in Kind. It's available for free online. There he's explaining how he isn't betraying the revolution by rolling back socialism and how they can only have state capitalism for right now, but it's better than regular capitalism. And it all comes from the fact that you have to have, before you can have socialism, you have to go through capitalism. And they haven't gone through capitalism. They don't have the established means of production to make socialism possible. And so he creates state capitalism for that purpose. Stalin will later call it socialism in one country, abandoning the revolution altogether.
Support for a strong military, and as we said, repression of freedom of speech. All right, now let's jump into the economic policies. A central idea of communist ideology was opposition to private ownership of the means of production, which blended with economic intervention within the private and public sectors. Now, to that, Nazism was different up to a certain extent. Let me clarify. Their overall economic approach favored big business and opposed labor unions, which of course doesn't make it sound socialist by any means. But we also have to remember a very important factor to this. In Hitler's speeches from 1920s, he clearly established his idea of what National Socialism was going to be. And mind you, it was only for Germans. And as he outlined his party program, he stated, open quote, that nationalization appears to me to be wrong. Close quote. So, at least in the 1930s, he was sort of in favor of the idea of maintaining private property. But was he? Well, I do have an opinion on that, but let me quote a sociologist and economist of the period. Check this out. Friedrich Pollock says, open quote, I agree that the legal institution of private ownership was maintained and that many attributes characteristic for National Socialism begin to manifest themselves, albeit still vaguely in non-totalitarian countries. But does this mean that the function of private ownership did not change? I believe it reaches far more deeply and should be described as the destruction of all the essential traits of private ownership. And I would like to underline that this specific economist.
Now, this seems to be a fair argument. Pollock was ethnically half Jewish and wasn't a Mises-type economist at all, but was seemingly warm to socialism, likely a Marxist as he was part of the Frankfurt School. But it would be an appeal of authority to leave it here. Now, but I also want to go say, because he does kind of leave it there, that this person, they're on the, they're left wing, and they said it's not quite capitalism, blah, blah, blah. And he uses that to try to say it's on the left. I don't think he understands why he's wrong. It's not him being intentionally shifty here. But let's go look at the full thing. And scroll up for a moment. It's from Is National Socialism a New Order by Frederick Pollock. And looks like it's a slightly different translation. You can see up here, I quite agree, the legal institution, blah, 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 up there. That started it, that he cuts partway through this paragraph, but we can see later, these rights have been transferred to ruling groups as a whole, and goes into more detail. So Pollock's argument is not at all that it is socialist in any way. He's not saying, this is Marxism. We didn't expect it, but that's what Hitler did. No. It's not a left-wing movement. It's a right-wing movement. His argument is not that it's left-wing, but that it's different than liberal capitalism. He points to it being controlled towards the interest, he points not to it being controlled towards the interests of the German populace, but led by an economic oligarchy. What he describes as something that freezes and reinforces hierarchy. And this is something that is actually slightly a move to the right. It's not individualistic. Individualism is not something that's simply, the further right you go, the more individualistic you get. It is something that is reinforcing hierarchy. And so you're going to do what's best for this small oligarchic group, the people who are, these robber barons of Germany, that you're all going to work here, not get undercut one another. You're going to have more total good, but nobody's going to grab more from the others. And we're going to make sure things are working on time. But it is not at all a left-wing transfer. It's a right-wing transfer here. You're ensuring more or less feudal structure here. You can't lose your feudal status unless, like the king literally steals, takes your title from you. Your count, whether you're, regardless of what you do, you have to either, get something from the king or the king takes something away from you. And let's go a little bit further. Yeah, we only have one more thing that I have to show that's not the video.
Just saying the private ownership actually wasn't a thing is left-wing. He was a left-wing economist. Moreover, in 1934, Hitler clearly established the fact that to him, wealth was for the national social state, not for the individual. And yes, the individual could.
Yes, he did. But the state is not the people, but for the nation, whose will is only expressible by him, the monarch or the leader. So it's not at all, it's couched in these populist terms that everything's for the, for the state, but it's concept basically, remember, I don't remember which one it was Louis the 14th, 15th, L'État et moi, I am the state. That is essentially what we're looking at here. Nazism is absolutist monarchy recreated under a different name. The state is Hitler, and it's going to be described in terms that make it seem like it's larger than Hitler, but essentially it's what's best for Hitler. The wealth is essentially not the people's. We can see such sentiments in absolutist monarchist states such as the Patriarchia, where Robert Filmer argues the king has the right to take everything from everybody, and the fact that he doesn't proves that he has our best interests at heart. And if you really want a good laugh, look up and read The Patriarchy. I think I found a copy online from the U of M. It sounds very, very fascist. He's attacking papists and bookmen and, well, attacking Catholics and academics. It's very, very similar to what you would see from neo-Nazis and the KKK in the period before Trump. Trump got a lot of Catholics on board, but the attack on the intelligentsia, the academics, that's definitely there. Now, Metatron can't see the difference between a monarchic state and a democratic state in terms of whose interests are served. This is a repeated pattern. For the left, it is about freeing individuals, even the poor. For the right, it is about the control of one or the few. And so the state is fundamentally different in these cases. It might be good to eventually do something more on these differences eventually. Individualism was left-wing in the 17th and 18th century because it was counterposed to monarchism. It is only right-wing when counterposed against further left ideologies. To an anarcho-capitalist, a welfare liberal is a communalist because they will limit excesses of the wealthy so the masses too can enjoy liberty. And that has to, that has been the 20th century American context when people are talking about individualism. It is wildly different from the individualism, that originally started. It's a different discussion completely. I don't know about you, but I don't side with the people who also argue you have the right to sell yourself into slavery here. I know that's technically a fallacy, but I think it's contextual criticism when it comes to who gets to enjoy liberty. Very much, that is a big thing. It's tied to the hierarchy. Who matters for the super? For the monarchy, it's one. For the oligarchy, it's a few. A small proportion of society that's elevated above it. Then you have democracy, it's a many. It gets bigger and bigger. More people are supposed to be sharing in the good of society the further left you go. And democracy was left of when it started. And there's critiques by Marxists of liberal democracy, that it's not sufficient, that it's not meeting the needs of everybody. This is the left-right spectrum at work. And so there is something there that is concrete, that is timeless. Because these the same, the one, the many, the few. We were discussing that with Aristotle. We were discussing that with Hobbes. I'm still discussing it today because these are timeless. We're crossing more than 2,000 years. It's timeless here. This is not something that is, oligarchies are this way and that's how they were in ancient Greece. But here in modern America, oligarchies are okay and all that. No, that's not at all how politics works. And I hope that you can see what I'm saying here. Because remember, you should be thinking critically. I'm telling you, think critically. He's bringing up thinking critically. You should be thinking critically. I say this because it helps. It prompts you to think critically. All right.
Would enjoy some of that wealth, but it's thanks to the state. And in 1942, when he was in power, he stated, open quotes, the land was national property, and in the end, it's only given to the individual as a loan. Does that sound like private property to you? There is more to it. In 1937, Hitler had already established the fact that he would demand private industries to produce something that the state defined as being necessary. And they had two options. They either do it, which is great, or they don't, in which case the state will take control of that specific industry sector. It's not big government, that's massive government. All right, but if that's the
And I think I already addressed that.
case, if this is what Hitler believed, and by the way, this is confirmed by SS letters, even all the way up to 1944, that was exactly his position, and we can see in the way he acted. But if that was the case, then why did he not say private property is abolished? I mean, the Soviets did it. Why did he say, no, private property is still a thing? Well, he said that because it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter that legally there was still a definition for private property as long as what he gets is what he gets. And
No. They may be limited in what they do, but the owner's capital still get the profit. So there is some big benefit there. And that's the primary benefit. That is the key. In fact, owners of big businesses generally don't control their holdings these days. It's about wealth management, which they would still have. I'm not saying that nobody actually goes deeply in. We've seen Elon Musk take over Twitter's side. Here's a whole bunch of systems that are redundant. I'm going to save money by taking them out. See, it did nothing. And he's saying that while everyone in America is fine and people outside of America can't get on Twitter because those redundancies matter. And it's that sort of thing why most people, people are a little bit smarter. No, hey, I don't want to mess with this myself when I don't know what I'm doing. They hire people who can manage their money, who can run their companies and all that, and they do it for them. The Waltons, Walmart's essentially a family business. You look at a lot of those Southern companies, Hobby Lobby or whatnot, it's a central business. They don't run it themselves. They have people who do stuff for them. You may have some that will go put on a show, pretend that they do something, but they often don't. And so there is some limitations. It's a class interest, but it's not the working class interest. It's opposed to the working class interest. This is the bourgeoisie as the new aristocrats. That is the class interests that are being put, which is a very right-wing thing. It's not a left-wing idea at all. And once again, just Metatron's not seeing that difference because he's not looking at it deeply, and it's probably because he's not trained to look at these things deeply. He's not. He's just looking. I know this word. I know this word. This is, I understand this concept in this sense, and just superficially pasting it on, which is not what you want to do when you're covering something like this.
Besides, of course, he understood that in a moment of war, you can't fight outside and also fight inside with the private sector. So he made the statement, private property stays, but then they control all of it, including demand, production, means of production, prices, everything. The government tells you what to produce, who to buy from, and what prices you sell. In other words, at least from an economic standpoint, in the discussion of private property, this was socialism disguised as capitalism.
That is not what socialism is about at all. It is close to Stalinist Russia in a sense, but that was state capitalism. Remember, Pollock said it was oligarchic control, not democratic control. And I think that is the key. And we're going to cover that more in the next video because I already wrote all the notes for both videos. But no, I'll tell you, it's feudalism disguised as capitalism. It's not at all socialism disguised as capitalism. But if you only look at thinking that right-wing liberalism, this classic liberalism or anarcho-capitalism is the is the right wing and it stops there, it seems like this is something left-wing. But when you see the full picture, the full spectrum, you realize, No, this is going back to a past thing that we tell ourselves we're past, but we're not. This is going back, reinstating a feudal structure where you have a position that you are born into. You inherit this position, and so you benefit from it as such. And you are getting the labor, but your average count, I'm sure, did not go around. And Metatron could probably correct me here because he knows about this kind of stuff for real. I'm sure the count didn't go down and try to micromanage the fields and tell people, go here or there. It's just saying it's produced and you get it, and it's controlled at some level. The king makes some decisions that direct trade, but they weren't quite as hands-on back then. That's something that we can say is a little bit different from feudalism. It's a neo-feudalism in a sort. It's more advanced, where it's the economic production is much more complex than it was in the Middle Ages. It's not just agriculture for the most part. So they're getting much more into the nitty gritty, but you still have that same basic class structure, which tells you how wealth's being distributed. It's not liberal capitalism, but it's definitely not socialism. Those aren't the only two choices here.
Now, of course, when you compare it to the Soviet Union, that had a complete centrally planned economy, this doesn't sound as extreme. But then again, the Soviets had a main goal, which was to increase the military power of the state. Sounds familiar? All right, now I would like to dedicate a small section to race, because of course this was not only a connection, so race and racism was a connection to, I want to say, Nazi ideology, but it was also a congenital element within the system. And another thing that the Nazis did was to put the blame of many of society's problems, particularly of the Germans, to migration. Moreover, apart from the Holocaust, there was clearly a sort of differential treatment under the law based on your racial affiliation. Now, this is of course real. It happened. And we can see some of these themes, particularly the ultra-nationalistic ones, in modern-day far-right ideologies. With that being said, let's also remember that if you think that racism denotes right-wing position, then you would classify Karl Marx as a right-winger. And the reason I say that is because if you actually read the article he published in 1844 called On the Jewish Question, you would absolutely consider to be racist. And
if you did it without context, sure, you would automatically consider that racist. Marx was ethnically Jewish. His parents converted to, I think, some form of Protestantism. But ethnically he was Jewish, and he was aware of that. And he was responding to Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer wrote The Jewish Question. So On the Jewish Question was a response to the Jewish question. And as such, it's going to frame how Marx speaks, what framework he's speaking from, because he's responding to something. Same way that I'm responding to Metatron. I'm going to be working off of, I'm not presenting this in the way that I think is most efficient to make you understand what Nazi Germany was. I'm doing it in relation, how it's most efficient to be doing it with Metatron, working off of what Metatron wrote. There is scholarly debate of whether Marx's materialist interpretation of what society had forced Jews to live in stereotype was anti-Semitic in itself, or just an artistic way of arguing in favor of the Jews, as he did take the side of the Jews on the question. There was no need to abolish Judaism and convert to Christianity to get political and social rights. Notably, several Jewish scholars interpret it in that latter way. It's not very clear that he was being anti-Semitic. If you're reading it out of context, absolutely it looks anti-Semitic as hell. He does use some very bad stereotypes of Jews, but he also describes it as being separate from Judaism itself. And remember, he's ethnically Jewish. This would apply to him. It's not Judaism that makes it that. He's saying that, there's this trope of Jews. And that would describe him theoretically if he was being serious. So I lean towards the artistic interpretation myself. But we'll get into that a little bit more in a little bit, because we could go 7 seconds before I have to interrupt again.
Also, Marx didn't really like Mexicans. That's another thing that he did. And Friedrich Engels said quite a lot of horrible things about black people.
Now, they're being racist and even eugenicists on the left, because you mentioned the eugenicists, but there were eugenicists. Doesn't make it not right-wing to be racist. Racism is a concept that prescribes inequality, whereas equality is left-wing. Remember, from the one to the many, hierarchy to equality. This is how this thing works. I'm doing on my right for the left for some reason. I don't know. I always get those flipped in my mind when I'm imagining the left-right scale. Weird thing there. Now, prescribes inequality, whereas equality is left-wing, through a racial hierarchy being a right-wing concept, formed to explain why Europeans got to keep Africans in slavery once they converted to Christianity. Hell, even Lincoln was rabidly racist, despite opposing slavery. It was very persistent in the world, in the period. For Marx in Mexico, it's unlikely he was pulling on a stereotype that didn't yet exist. The only quote I can find on that anyways was from the Daily Signal, an instrument of the Heritage Foundation, authors of Project 2025. So these are disinformation people. These are people who you distrust as a heuristic because they habitually lie on purpose over and over to push politics, their political stance. We're going to go into, they're engaged in operational irrationalism. Next video, I'll go into more detail about that. There was no citation given by them for that. They didn't say where he said this. They say he said it. Where, I don't know where he supposedly said it. Though I do think it might be of some relevance to point out the leaders around the time. Now, the actual president of Mexico at the time of the war did look like a little bit, sort of like you think of Mexicans today. But the average, more common, you have people who are clearly of only Spanish blood. Here's the guy who took over after him. Does he look like, Mexicans today? No. He looks like a white guy because he was a white guy. I'm sure if you trace it back, he has, in the past, previous 300 years, just, European ancestors. And he is, this is the Mexicans that they're speaking about, because the Mexicans didn't actually get out to areas like Canada and Utah en masse. They were fairly unsettled, being held for the future. So if there wasn't a discussion about them being lazy, he's not necessarily speaking about Mexicans as we see Mexicans today, but he's referring to other white people. But once again, I can't, the only source I could find for something like this was very untrustworthy. It's like watching PragerU. It's not certain that actually happened at all. But where the people on the left are racist, that is a failing, not something of the left. It is fallacious to claim that because one person is racist and on the left, that racism isn't right-wing. It tells you that Metatron doesn't understand what makes something right or left. And I'll point out in the next video, I'm going to be covering this point again, because the same type of thing he says here, he tries to go the opposite route in the next video. Now, when we go a little bit further.
Now I would like to talk about an argument that is the one that shocks me the most, and it's the claim that Hitler was a Christian. Now, of course, I'm going to debunk this. I'm going to do it by, quoting from Hitler's own words with his own letters, and then we're going to look at how he changed his rhetoric before and after he became chancellor and then dictator. But before we do all of that, let me just say this. Do you really think that the leader of the most anti-Semitic regime the world has ever seen would have worshipped Jesus of Nazareth? Now, given one of the things that people say when they underline this idea that, well, Hitler was a Christian, is that they say that he was baptized as a Catholic. But I'd like to underline that not all Christian religions consider baptism or perform baptism the same way. I mean, differently from, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, the Catholics baptize you when you are a baby. So it's not like Hitler had any say to it. If that alone, the idea of being baptized within the Catholic Church, is enough for you to say, well, Hitler was a Christian, that you should consider Stalin a Christian, since he actually went to seminary. It was Orthodox, but still. Hitler's real intent towards the church was eroding the core doctrines of the Christian religion until there was virtually nothing left of its original function, in order to slowly substitute it with a puppet used for social control, which would also have followed with the confiscation of all the places of worship, something actually quite similar to what is happening today in China. So there.
Okay, now what does this have to do with left or right? What does this have to do with Metatron subconsciously trying to distance himself from Hitler, as he is center-right in America? Hitler wasn't on the right, if you consider these convoluted points, and he isn't Christian. That's the only connection I can make here. I mean, obviously, did I write more? I swear I did. I want to jump ahead if I don't have to. Yeah, I get a little bit more before I go in more about the Christianity thing.
Alone doesn't really make me feel confident about, Hitler's Christian beliefs. Oh, and the fact that he shot quite a lot of Polish priests dead. There is that. You see, during the beginning of his political career, Hitler publicly expressed favorable opinions towards traditional Christian ideas. That's true, but later he abandoned them. Most historians agree that he was adversarial towards organized Christianity. Oh, and he also criticized atheism, so he had a bone to pick with everyone. Now, if you examine some of his early talks, you'll see that he considered himself as a German Christian. He said, I'm not a Catholic, I'm a German Christian, and even a member of positive Christianity. Not member, but like a supporter of positive Christianity. But you see, positive Christianity is not even Christianity, as they rejected fundamental core doctrines of Christianity, such as the, divinity of Jesus. So yeah, not Christians. And when it comes to German Christians, it was a type of Protestant church or group that supported Nazi ideologies. That's why he said that. Thus, in Hitler's eyes, Hitler detested Christian ethics. He said it was fit for slaves.
Now, that's a Nietzsche reference. Hitler was nominally Christian, but he promoted Nietzsche, and Nietzsche denounced Christianity as Jewish slave morals. He, certain that Hitler didn't believe in Christianity, and one of Yeshua's big changes to the Jewish view is love thy neighbor was originally seen as love your fellow Jewish person. Whereas Yeshua said, no, the end is coming. It means everyone now. Everyone. So obviously, Hitler only loving Germans. And actually he really hated the Germans too, but that's neither here nor there. But, that's the idea you generally get from what he did. That is, that's very unchristian. A lot of things he did, the whole idea of the hierarchy and the, his anti-welfare stance that Metatron got wrong. Those are very anti-Christian, teachings. Christian church today. I mean, right now we have the Catholic Church has a semi-decent pope, but you have a lot of Christian denominations that obviously are not held by a single pope. You look at evangelical Christianity, it's toxic, it's very anti-Christian. I mean, there's a lot of them out there who literally believe Donald Trump is the Antichrist, and they are supporting Donald Trump because they think that will bring Jesus back, thinking that Jesus will be happy you brought me back. No, you frickin' serving who you thought was the Antichrist, you idiot. But we'll go on to the end.
And in 1937, he publicly said that the Christian church or Christianity was ripe for destruction. And that doesn't sound like a Christian to me. So the idea that Hitler was a Christian is nonsense. And his ostentatious hatred towards Christianity wouldn't really work or go very well with, say, modern day faith and flag right-wing Americans. With all being said, as you can see, there are many aspects to this. Yes, some of his policies were in fact right-wing, others would have been left-wing. If you were to take like one of those quizzes online, what you could do is try with your own, with your own understanding of these, you could try an answer. Like every time you get a question, you could ask a question, what would Hitler respond to that, and try to do it. And you'll see that sometimes you'll go right, sometimes you go left. Therefore, Nazism should not be judged by whatever words Hitler crafted, and it should not be considered neither left nor right-wing, at least in the political sense. The only thing in which Hitler believed was accumulating personal power. And we have a name for that: totalitarianism. Thank you for watching.
Okay, so yeah, I might as well take this off of that share. Boom. Yep. And okay. All right. So Hitler was right-wing by European standards, and he is right-wing overall. This was a 9th grade essay of a kid trying to explain how he wasn't Hitler. Metatron isn't a Nazi. He isn't a fascist. He is socially conservative, probably specific on family values. He probably has fallen to some fascist propaganda, but fascist propaganda to get conservatives to collaborate. My handwriting's horrible. Okay, yeah, I did read it right, and just hear me far enough. My bigotry is free speech, and you cannot criticize me for it type thing. Which, not saying that Metatron is bigoted. He buys into the idea that people shouldn't be criticized when they practice free speech. I got a bit of that from him, from all the videos I've seen. Conservatism itself is actually neither left nor right, but supports slow change so as to not tear the social fabric. In post-Soviet Russia, for example, conservatives were on the left. It's the only ideology I can point to that is literally neither left nor right, because it can move around. Specific instances of conservative ideology are left or right. But conservatism itself is based on the idea of slow change and keeping the social fabric from tearing. Burkean, Edmund Burke. What Metatron is conserving is right-wing traditional patriarchal family structures. I haven't seen him be hateful. They're trying to force these views on others, but it makes him center right. Here not in incel way, though. That's not what I'm saying. These incels go crazy with that stuff and think that their wife, they have the right to have somebody just have sex with, that they're their slave and all that fun stuff. Here he let that have him put out nonsense. And that's what we're looking at with this video. It wasn't good. Metatron does very good stuff when he deals just with history. But when he walks into politics, he walks into sociology, he makes a fool of himself. And that is, something we'll address more at the end of the next video. It's way too long for me to be doing them both. We're at an hour, 40 minutes almost. So thank you. Have a good day. If you're not too tired, click to watch the other video. If you are too tired, watch it another day. Bookmark it. Remember to like, subscribe if you're not subscribed, and you intend on watching videos, and of course, share. I end stream.